middle of the Atlantic. It's about 2,200 kilometers to Brazil, and it's about 2,200 kilometers to Africa. 7 degrees below the equator. The equator goes through Sao Tome Island here. Okay, that's Ascension. And Santa Helena Island is about 1,500 kilometers southeast. It's here. Several years ago, a friend of mine told me that an English professor from the University of Aberdeen is organizing an expedition to Ascension Island. And I said, oh, this is very interesting. I always wanted to go to the Ascension Island. So I asked her for the name and the email address, and she gave it to me. And then I sent to Professor Brickel at Aberdeen all my publications on the coast of West Africa. Many publications on Sao Tome, Cameroon, Senegal, Sierra Leone, etc., etc. And I wrote him, well, this could be maybe good for comparison with your work at Ascension Island. And then I waited. And indeed, 2 weeks later, he wrote me and asked me if I wanted to join his expedition to Ascension Island, which of course was what I had been hoping for. And he said it will be everything paid from Oxford on, because if you want to go to Ascension Island, you first have to go to Oxford in Britain. You have to go to a military airport. Ascension Island is a military base, a British Marine military base, the whole island. And you fly there from an airport near Oxford, you fly to Ascension Island, and the reason for this, now I have to play with, is this. Ascension Island is pretty much halfway to the Falkland Islands. And as you all know, the Falkland Islands are British. There was even a war a few years ago with Argentina. And Great Britain wants to keep its hand on Falkland Islands. And the importance for Ascension is that here the ships can get petrol and airplanes are stationed to get quickly to Falkland Islands. So the importance for Ascension for Britain is that it's a military base close to Falkland Islands. And Paul Brickel, who is teaching at Aberdeen, actually is at the same time as the fisheries director of Falkland Islands. So it's going between Falkland Islands and United Kingdoms frequently. And he always has to make a stop over at Ascension Island. And at Ascension Island, he thought, well, there's very little known about the marine biology of Ascension Island. Let's try to make an expedition. So he made a grant proposal to the Darwin Foundation, and he actually got the money, and we made the expedition to Ascension Island. Ascension Island is a rather small island. It's about 15 kilometers from north to south and from east to west. There's only one town, Georgetown. And it's a very mountainous island. It's only about 1 million years old, volcanic, and that's what it looks like. It looks like the moon. There's almost no rain, so there's no erosion. This is really like the moon. Because there is no tourism, there are no hotels, no pensions, no apartments for rent. We were sleeping in the military barracks during the expedition. And we went and recorded everything, simply everything, all the marine life we could get. Collected, photograph it, and try to identify it and send it to specialists. Here you see the intertidal with lots of Austria oysters. And here you see the intertidal again. And what you see here is a little crab, Grapsus ascensionis. It's even called Ascension Island. It was described from Ascension Island, but it's the same species we have here in Madeira. It's a little red crab, which is, well, it's actually not so small. It's a red crab, very common in the intertidal. In the intertidal we already see the first coral, Siderastrea radians, and corals actually was one of the groups I concentrated on. I collected corals, and together with some specialists, Helena in Marseille was the first author, we wrote a paper on the corals of Ascension Islands, only 5 species. I'll come back to this later. The coast is very steep. There are only a few places where you can actually go to the sea, and this is one of them. It's called Comfortless Cove. So from this place we went into the water many, many times for snorkeling and also for scuba diving. This is the part of the bay. And it was an international expedition. Here you see Kostas Tsiamis, who is a Greek plant expert. There were about 30 people in the whole expedition, never at the same time. Some people were coming and going all the time. And as you can see, we also did some scuba diving collections. And the government gave us a boat to go around the island, because, as I said, there are few places where you can go to the sea. And the first time you go into the water, you say, this cannot be possible. Every report on Ascension Island says there is an incredible amount of black triggerfish. You read it and you say, okay, there's an incredible amount of triggerfish. And then you go into the water and says, there is an incredible amount of triggerfish. I mean, you don't believe it when you see it. It's absolutely impossible. Where the hell do all these fish come from? The triggerfish eat everything. The rocks are completely bare. There are only sponges on the rocks because they're poisonous, and there are zoantid anemones on the rocks because they're poisonous. Everything else the triggerfish eat. Of course, there is an enormous primary production. We are in the tropics. There are plants growing madly, but every plant which is growing is immediately eaten. So the botanists took some rocks into aquaria, and the plants were growing, and then I could identify them. But in the marine environment, the rocks are totally bare because the triggerfish eat everything. To give you an idea about them, it's called black triggerfish, but if you get it a little bit closer, you see they're really beautiful, they're blue. Here is the view from the town pier. You look down, you say, lots of triggerfish. And when you're diving and you look up, it looks like this. It's absolutely incredible the amount of triggerfish. Fortunately, they do not bite. Our triggerfish here in Madeira sometimes bite, yeah? But this one, fortunately, do not. So, one of the many results was simply a species list for fishes. We have recorded 168 species, 39 were new records, 8% are endemic for Ascension Island, and another 12% are endemic for Ascension and St. Helena Islands. As I told you, St. Helena Island is the closest land to Ascension Islands, and there are actually quite a number of species of fishes which are endemic for Ascension and St. Helena Island. Now let's look at these endemic species first. This is a beautiful little fish. It's only about 4 centimeters long. It's a centrifuge, and it's actually quite common in the Madeira area. This is an endemic hawkfish, Bodianus insularis, very closely related to the one species we have here, but it's only at Ascension Island, nowhere else in the whole world. This is an endemic chaetodontid butterfly fish, Chaetodon Sancta Helena, because it's endemic for Ascension and St. Helena Island. And this one is also endemic, Stegastes luwocki, you can find only on Ascension Island. So there is quite a lot of endemic species. Like Thalassoma ascensionis, it's related to our Thalassoma, but it's an endemic species of Ascension Island. And this little blenny, Entomacrotus textilis, is endemic for Ascension and St. Helena Island. This one, also, it's a little goby, Criolepis ascensionis, is endemic for St. Helena and Ascension Island. So we have the endemic species, and for the non-endemic species, we also find some undescribed species. This is an undescribed blenny. It doesn't have a name. It will be described. So for the non-endemic species, we can ask, where did they come from? Because we have Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic, and it's a very young island, it's only about 1 million years old, and everything which is living at the shores today must have come from somewhere, either from the Western Atlantic or from the Eastern Atlantic. This surgeonfish, Acanthurus bahianis, definitely is from the Western Atlantic, because we do not find the species in the Eastern Atlantic, we only find it in the Western Atlantic. So it came from the Western Atlantic to Ascension Island. And we can even be more precise, because this species only exists in Brazil. So it must have come from Brazil to Ascension Island. And this species, Pomacanthus paro, also is a Western Atlantic species. So it must have come from the Western Atlantic to the Azores, to Ascension, sorry. This is one of the many new records we made. It's a cardinal perch, Apogum pseudo-maculatus, and it's a Western Atlantic species, only in the Western Atlantic. Echidna catenata, only in the Western Atlantic and Ascension Island. Morena pavonina, only in Brazil and Ascension Island, etc., etc. But Gymnothorax unicolor is an Eastern Atlantic species. We have it here at Madeira. It's actually quite common. And Trachinotus ovatus is an Eastern Atlantic species. We also have it here at Madeira. So, apparently, both sides of the Atlantic, Western Atlantic and Eastern Atlantic, have contributed to the marine fauna and flora of Ascension Island. And at the end, when you do the counts, you can say the end result is about 70% of the species came from the Western Atlantic and about 30% of the species came from the Eastern Atlantic. We can do the same with invertebrates, of course. Here you have the fireworm Hermodice carunculata, which is the Western Atlantic species. Here at Madeira we have Hermodice nigrolineata, which is the Eastern Atlantic species. But at Ascension we have the Western Atlantic. Corals. This is an undescribed species of Madracis. There are only 5 coral species on Ascension Island. One of them turned out to be an undescribed species. And the paper on the corals, and also the paper on the fishes, and on the anemones, and on the crabs, etc., was already published in a special Ascension volume of Journal of the Marine Biological Association, which came out about 2 months ago. We did a paper on the opistobrags. Here you see a nudibranch called, Platydorus angustipes, which is a Western Atlantic species. This is very interesting. I must admit that I did not find it myself. The botanists came and, why does this not? The botanists came and told me and asked me, what is this strange creature between our plants? And I said, oh wow, this is interesting. It's an opistobrag. Look, here are the eyes. This is my fingernail, sorry, it's a bit dirty. So you see the size of them, here are the eyes, here are the antennae. So after the botanists found it and showed me in the microscope, I went into the sea again and I collected it, I found it. We did the encrusting anemones. The specialist in Japan wrote the paper. This is Parazoanthus swifti, a Western Atlantic species. Crustaceans. Sammy de Grave at Oxford was a little bit arrogant. He said, I have been there, I have everything, you're not going to find anything new. I'm using a method which is a little bit unfair. I'm using anesthetic, and I spray the anesthetic into holes in the rock, and sometimes some anesthetized fish or crustaceans is falling out of it. This is a very, very strange crustaceans. It's Odontotsonia anastome. The species was described from a single male and then never found again. I have 2 females and 1 male. This is the female. You can see the eggs at the belly. No? And the next photo is the male. And this is the male. So this was described just from 1 male and then never found again. And I have other species of shrimps which were not recorded from Ascension Island. Here you see again the type of larva, and at the southern end of Ascension Island there are some pools which are very, very famous. They're so-called Procaris pools. You have to walk about 25 minutes through the lava to get there. And these pools are about 200 meters away from the shore. The water goes up and down in the tidal rhythm, so they're connected to the sea by tunnels. And in the tunnels mainly, but also in the pool, there is living a shrimp, which is called Procaris ascensionis. It's blind, they don't have eyes, because they mainly live in the tunnels. And this is a very, very special shrimp. You probably all know about Latimeria, which is this fish which was described as a fossil many years ago, and then they found it in Madagascar. They thought it was dead, it was only an extinct species. It's a very, very ancient type of fish. This is the Latimeria of the shrimps. It's an incredibly ancient type of shrimp. And it lives only in these pools at Ascension Island. Okay, here we see Paul Brickle, and as I told you, he's a fisheries expert. So the main aim of the expedition actually was not biodiversity, it was fishery. And they're taking the otoliths, the ear stones, out of the fishes. They measure the size and the weight, and with the otoliths you can find the age. So they did a lot of work on fishery biology. We also put some data loggers into the water. During 1 year, they recorded the light and the temperature and the water depth. If you dive at night, then most of the fishes are sleeping. So you here see a sleeping black triggerfish, and when they're sleeping, of course, you can take nice photos. These two are sleeping. Okay, this was the part on Ascension Island. How do I get out of this? And we change to St. Helena. Yep, here we are. I told you already, St. Helena Island is about 1,500 kilometers southeast of Ascension, and it's even more difficult to get to than Ascension Island. There is no airport, they're just building the airport, so the only way to get there is by ship. You can take a ship from Cape Town, which goes to St. Helena Island, to Ascension, and then back again. It takes a long time, it's very expensive, and the other method is to go by plane to Ascension Island, and then get that same ship and go to St. Helena Island. But then you, of course, you have to wait until the ship is going again. I mean, you're caught on this island. You cannot get off it until the next ship comes. So during the Ascension expedition, I met Judith Brown, and she told me, well, the next 2 years I'm going to be studying the marine biology of St. Helena Island. I said, oh, this is fantastic. I always wanted to go to St. Helena Island, and my friend Peter Wirtz in Hamburg also. We come and visit you. And that's exactly what we did. We went to, we took a plane to Ascension and the ship to St. Helena Island. It's again a very small island, only about 15 times 15 kilometers like Ascension. It's older, 10 million years, it's not much also. And it's again very mountainous, it's difficult to find access to the sea. This is when the boat approaches the main town, Jamestown, and some of you may know that Napoleon Bonaparte was living on Ascension Island. He died on Ascension Island. He first lived about here in Jamestown, and he later moved inland. And so there are actually people living on Ascension Island in contrast to us on St. Helena Island. On Ascension Island, nobody is living. There are only soldiers and people working for soldiers. There's nobody living there permanently. On St. Helena Island, there is a local population, and we were able to get an apartment up there. With our apartment, more or less. And there are cruise ships coming to St. Helena Islands. Every year, hundreds of French people come to see the place where Napoleon was living and died. So this is the harbor of Jamestown. The harbor is actually more to the left. And from here we did many excursions. We went snorkeling and diving from here, all around here, and we took a boat all around the island. And we did essentially the same thing. We just photographed everything and collected species and tried to identify them and sent them to specialists. And the result, again, were many. How do I get rid of this again? I don't know. This. Thank you. So, we went out with the boat, and very frequently we came across whale sharks. At that time of the year, it was January, the whale sharks aggregate around St. Helena Island because the fishes are spawning and the eggs are accumulating in the water, and they eat the eggs. This is a baby, it's only about 5 meters long. You can see he's taking the eggs from the surface of the water. Now this one is quite a bit longer. The ladder is 1 meter, and this creature was more than 10 meters. The maximum known size for whale sharks, well, some people say it's 18 meters, but the documented maximum size is 12 meters, and we certainly saw one which was 12 meters because our boat was 10 meters, and when it passed the boat there was a little bit in front of it and there was a little bit behind the boat, so it was definitely 12 meters long. So frequently when we went out with the boat we saw whale sharks, and of course we were snorkeling with them, we were diving with them, and it's a fantastic experience. But I must say, after some time, we said, okay, we've had enough of whale sharks. We want to go diving. No more whale sharks, please. I did not think that in my life I would come to the point where I said, please, no more whale sharks. And underwater, it looks totally different from Ascension Island because the black triggerfish are not there. There are a few, but not many. So things are growing like this feather star, plants. There's a lot of life on the rocks, in contrast to Ascension Island. So let's look at the endemic species first. This is Sparistromas trigatum, which is an endemic species of Santa Helena Island. And there is a molecular phylogeny of the parrotfishes which shows that the species closely related to this one is our species here, Sparisoma cretense. So many years ago, million years ago, Sparisoma cretense arrived at Santa Helena Island and evolved into a new endemic species there. This is the femur of the same species. This is Thalassoma sancta Helena. You remember that we had Thalassoma ascensionis, endemic species for Ascension, and this is a Thalassoma endemic for Santa Helena. This is Sextas sancta Helena, and this is Chaetodon sancta Helena. Remember I showed one photo of Chaetodon sancta Helena from Ascension Island, which was a single animal, but at Santa Helena you get these schools of thousands of Chaetodon sancta Helena. It's very impressive to see. And again, we find Eastern Atlantic species like our moray eel Gymnothorax unicuro. So the story really is the same. Santa Helena Island was colonized from the western and from the eastern Atlantic. One of the many new records we made there was this little fish, Centopyga aurantonotus, which was only known from Brazil, and we found it at Santa Helena Island. My wife, this is the favorite photo of my wife. Look at the colors. Isn't that incredible? Ambliciuritis pinus, which is a Western Atlantic species. I'll make it a little bit larger. Isn't that fantastic? It's about 10 centimeters long. And again, Acanthurus bahianus, which is only known from Brazil. But then we have some big surprises. This species and several other fish species and some mollusks and some crustaceans are only known from the Indo-Pacific Ocean and Santa Helena Island. The only place in the whole Atlantic where this species, Uraspis helbola, is occurring is Santa Helena Island. It's only at Santa Helena Island and in the Indo-Pacific. It's a totally crazy geographic pattern. Yeah? There is a current going around the tip of South Africa, and then it goes directly to Santa Helena Island. And most species, Indo-Pacific species, which are in that current, cannot survive the cold water at South Africa. They all die, because it's really cold South Africa, tip of South Africa. But some of them, apparently, made it to Santa Helena Island. So we have a really strange geographic pattern. We have species which live in the Pacific, and the only place in the Atlantic is Santa Helena Island. This is an Eastern Atlantic species. I took photos of the same species at Sao Tome Island, for instance, Ostracium acanthonotus. It's very difficult to take a photo of this animal because it comes at you all the time. You say, no, don't come so close. Take a photo of it. And the result, of course, again, is the first result is a simple species list. We have 193 species recorded from Santa Helena Island. You remember it was 170 something from Ascension, and this is a very, very low number. I mean, here at Madeira we have more than 500. At the Canary Islands we have far more than 600. So this is a very low number of species, and we are in the tropics. We would expect more species than Madeira and the Canaries, but we have really which can colonize over such a great distance. They're also quite young, the islands, 1 million and 10 million years, it's not very long. So the isolation and the young age probably explains why we have so few species. For comparison, look at the Azores. I mean, there are many species missing at the Azores, which are very common species here, Madeira and the continental coast of Portugal. For instance, sepia, choco in Portuguese, they never made it to the Azores. 1,000 kilometers is too far for sepia. They didn't make it. And of course, there are no sepia and no chocos in Ascension or in Santa Helena. So to colonize over such a large distance is difficult, and that is the explanation, the main explanation for the low species number of fishes. And the same thing happens in all other groups. I mean, there are only 5 coral species. In the tropics, you would expect 30, 40, 50. We have more than 10 at Madeira. So low species numbers. We made 18 new records. 9 of the species are endemic to Santa Helena Island, and 16 of the species are endemic to Ascension and Santa Helena Island. So, as I said, this is a really simple species list, but there is actually quite a lot which you can do with these species lists, because, of course, similar lists exist for other areas. We have a list just like this for Sao Tome and Principe. We have a list like this for Madeira, which Manuel Biscoito and Ronald Frick and I made. And we have a list like this for the Cape Verde Islands. And of course, there are lists like this for, say, Curacao, Cuba, Florida. So what you can do, you can compare them. And you can compare them in a quantitative way. The result you get is a similarity dendrogram. It shows you which place is most similar in its formal composition to which other place. And I will show you the same thing in a different way. The same graph in a different way, which is easier to understand, I think. It's the same graph, just plotted in a different way. Because we are on Madeira Island, we start at Madeira Island. Madeira Island, in its coastal fish fauna, is most similar to the Azores. These are the 2 most similar places. And this, again, is most similar to the Canary Islands. So we have Azores, Madeira, Canaries as the 3 most similar entities, biogeographic entities in coastal fishes. But if you do the same with crustaceans, or you will get the same result, I expect, and if you do the same with mollusks, you will get the same result. You probably all know that Madeira and the Canaries and Azores are united as the so-called Macaronesian Islands. And this was done by terrestrial botanists. Terrestrial botanists created the term Macaronesian Islands. And you would not really expect that the same is true for the marine environment. Maybe yes, maybe no. I did not expect it to be true for the marine environment. But it is. Big surprise. It actually is true. Azores, Madeira, Canaries are even underwater. Not only on land, but even underwater. They are biogeographic unity. Now, most of you probably also know that some idiot joined the Cape Verde Islands to Macaronesia for political reasons, I think, not for biological reasons. It makes no sense whatsoever for biology. The Cape Verde Islands on terrestrial, from a terrestrial view and from a marine view are not Macaronesia. Look at this. The Cape Verde Islands are most similar in coastal fishes to the Gulf of Guinea. And these 2 are most similar to Northwest Africa and tropical Africa. So it's really different. So we have the tropical Eastern Atlantic, we have the northeastern Atlantic. Oh, Azores, Madeira, Canaries is most closely related to the Mediterranean Sea. So we have the northern Atlantic, and here you have Ascension and Santa Helena are actually in their formal composition related to South Africa. And we can do the same in the Eastern Atlantic, which we're not going to do now. We come to the invertebrates again. This is one of my babies. It's a species named for me, Lucta Wirtzi. I found it at Madeira Island and sent it to a specialist because I think this is something strange, it's something new. And the specialist described it and named it for me. And when I was diving at Santa Helena Island, I suddenly see Leuctomis wirtzi. I said, oh, wow, nice. I had babies on Santa Helena Island even before I came there. And one of them is Leuctomis wirtzi. It's a worm in a tube in the ground, and you just see the tentacles sticking out. We did collect zoantid encrusting anemones again, and the specialist in Japan is just writing the paper. We did collect corals. This is actually a coral, not a sea anemone. Dendrophylia sancta Helena, and this is Clairhelia sancta Helena, another coral species. And Helena in Marseille is writing the first draft of the paper. Black corals are one of my favorite groups because many species are living on black corals. You don't see them at first sight because they're very well protected. But I always, when I see black corals, say, oh, wow, let's see what's living on them. And we found lots of new species at Santa Helena. For instance, this beautiful ovolid snail, which is living on black corals in Santa Helena Island. It's an undescribed species. And this black coral, which does not look very impressive, but there were several shrimp species living on them, like this one, Rapipontonia platalea, and this one is Pseudocutieria wirtzi, another one of my babies, which I found in Sao Tome Island, and now also in Santa Helena. And when I saw this, I was very happy. This is a big sea anemone, which is also in Madeira Island. It can be this size, Thermatactis cricoides, and there are many crustaceans living close to it, and at Madeira, and apparently also at Santa Helena Island. When I saw this one, I said, wow, we have an undescribed species. It obviously is the genus Lismata, and there are only about 15 species in the Atlantic, and every one of them has a totally different color pattern. So when I saw this, I saw, oh, it's a new species of Lismata. And here we see it again in a plastic bag, just when I collected it. When I collect things, I always take the first photo of the animal in the plastic bag. It does not look very nice, but it's the first document for the species. And I think this is just a really beautiful shrimp. Sami de Grave in Oxford is just describing it as a new species of Lismata. This is Julius Brown and myself. We are looking at the animals just after coming out of the water. And that's her again, with two typical saints. The people from St. Helena Island call themselves saints, and they are an amazing mixture. The island, Santa Helena Island, originally was a Portuguese island. Many of the places, of the mountains for instance, still have Portuguese names. And then the British people came and took it away from the Portuguese by force. And then it was a British island, and still is a British island. But the British introduced many people as, well, not as slaves, as workers, and mainly from India. So after several hundred years, you have a mixture of Portuguese, British, and Indian. And this is the result. These are two very typical saints. They look like this. Several thousand people living on St. Helena Islands. During several dives, we saw Mobula. Mobula is a type of Shamanta with a wingspan of 4 meters sometimes. They are very beautiful animals. They fly through the water. It's fantastic to see them. And the Mobulas at Santa Helena Island, they were very inquisitive. They come at you directly. They swim towards you. And you think that it's going to hit you. I mean, it swims directly towards you. Just before it hits you, it turns around and looks at you. That's the eye. And this one has a big remora shark sucker attached to it. So they swim at you, and just before they hit you, they turn around and look at you like this. As I said, St. Helena is older than Ascension. There is rain, there is erosion, so you get plants on land. They're growing bananas, for instance. This is a banana plantation. Because there is tourism, you can also hire an apartment. This was our apartment. And in front of the apartment, there was a garden with flowers. And I said, oh, what's this? In one of my former lives, before I came to Madeira, I was actually working on the behavior of bees, of wild bees. There are more than 500 species of wild bees in Germany, about 20 wild bees in Madeira. So I saw this one, I said, wow, this is a Hylaeus. I recognized the genus, and I know this expert for that genus. So I collected this little bee. It's 1 centimeter about. Collected and sent it to the expert, and he found out it's a bee only known from South Africa. It probably was introduced to Santa Helena Island with the boat, which is making a connection all the time. So even an isolated island, it's somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, is already having a fauna change due to human activity. We also did some work in tide pools, because in tide pools you often get different species, but as I told you, the coast is very difficult to get to, so in some tide pools you have to go up and down with ropes like this. To go down is easy, but to go up is not so easy. And this actually is the last photo of my talk on Santa Helena and on Ascension Island. Thank you for your attention.
Muito obrigado. Alguém tem uma pergunta?
Pode ser em português, não? Too much. No. If you have one, you can ask me later when you see me. I mean, directly after such a talk, I know that you're just...
What about the marine plants?
The person I showed you was the diving tank. That was Kostas Tsiamis, a Greek plant expert, and they published a paper on the marine plants of Ascension Island in that special Ascension volume. And for Santa Helena Island, we did not do the plants.
So the results are similar? Do the algae come from all west and from both sides?
There are lots of endemic species, lots of new species, but the result is essentially the same. They are western and eastern Atlantic species.
Peter, em termos de biodiversidade marinha, Santa Helena é muito diferente, de uma forma geral, a tua primeira impressão é muito diferente da Ilha da Ascensão.
As I said, there are lots of endemic species for Santa Helena and Ascension Island, but because of the black triggerfish are not there in the masses, you get lots of species which you do not get at Ascension Island. There are many bryozoans, for instance, which are growing on the rocks, and Ascension there aren't any because they're being eaten all the time. So there's more biodiversity in Santa Helena, much more.
So what will be your next destination?
I go to Gabon in November. There's a French expedition, and they invited me to go to Gabon with them. I have to go to Paris, and after Paris it's all free. And I'm very much looking forward to that. I've been to Sao Tome, which is the same latitude. It's tropical. It's 0 degree. The equator goes through Sao Tome Island and it goes through Gabon. And I expect that there's a lot of similarity. That's why they invited me, because they know my papers on Sao Tome. But I also hope to find many new things, of course.
Okay. Thank you very much again for your presence and your nice talk. Thank you.